Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. There was no spare time to ask Bai Xiaochun about who the immortal imperatrix was. His scalp simply tingled at the shocking performance the old ghost woman had put on. Clearly, she had upped her game, releasing that shocking sea of black flames that she had never used before. Strangely, the sea of flames didn't seem to contain even a scrap of heat, and yet, his divine sense had indicated that it could definitely burn anything that got in its path. That in itself was enough to cause him to flee for his life. Thankfully, it seemed the old ghost woman wasn't very stable while in that state, and couldn't actually pursue him. He fled for 3 months straight, not slowing down for even an instant. Whenever he thought back to what had happened, he scowled in frustration and disappointment. During those 3 months, Bai Xiaochun didn't say much, but would occasionally look over his shoulder, his expression that of sorrow and frustration. Eventually, Bai Xiaochun couldn't help but ask, "Xiaoqi, who's this immortal imperatrix you were jabbering about?" In a rare display of rage, Bai Xiaoqun shouted, "You're not permitted to sully the immortal imperatrix by even mentioning her." Surprised, Bai Xiaochun looked over to see Bai Xiaoqi's bloodshot eyes shining with grief as he looked out into the void. After a long moment passed, he murmured, "The immortal imperatrix was Milord's Taoist partner. I never saw her in person. But Milord would often gaze upon a painting of her. I could see the pain in his eyes, and could see how much he missed her. Due to looking at that painting so many times myself, I eventually committed her features to memory. That young woman we saw earlier was the immortal imperatrix, and Milord was the immortal imperator." As he spoke, his voice grew quieter and quieter. However, he continued to look over his shoulder, as though he could see that black sea of flames, and the woman with the spike in her forehead. The immortal imperatrix. Bai Xiaochun knew that the Lord Bai Xiaoqun referred to was not himself, but rather, that sovereign from the immortal world. The fact that the old ghost woman had such an impressive origin finally gave him a clue as to why she was so powerful. The Taoist partner of a sovereign. Someone killed her, and not even he could resurrect her? I wonder, who could have done such a thing? He sat there thoughtfully, thinking about how, despite how long he had traveled within this void, and all of the ruins he had never seen anyone alive. Only the eternal immortal domains were left within this void that had once been a starry sky. It was the only place with life, surrounded by nothing but death and rubble. That led his train of thought to the fact that the original owner of the treasured fan, the sovereign from the immortal world who had passed the fan on to him, had once spoken of a great catastrophe to hit the starry sky. That in turn caused him to think of the enormous sovereign looming over the eternal immortal domains, that vicious, sleeping entity who was most definitely not dead. There is some enormous mystery at play here. A mystery that I have already begun to unravel. Bai Xiaochun sat there cross-legged on the fan, looking out at the void, wondering if the vile emperor and the saint emperor knew the truth. Regardless of whether or not they did, based on the clues he had unearthed so far, he was starting to get a general idea of his own. Some incomprehensibly powerful expert had massacred everything in the starry sky. All peoples, all lives, all other powerful experts. And he was none other than the enormous figure who existed above the eternal immortal domains. In the final battle over the eternal immortal domains, the Arch-Lord, Saint Lord, and Vile Lord, all of them sovereigns, had sacrificed their own lives to seal that enemy, placing him in a state of existence which had lasted until now. There were still many things Bai Xiaochun didn't understand. Who was that incomprehensibly powerful expert? Why did he want to massacre everything in existence? Why did he wait until the very end to make his move on the eternal immortal domains? And how could such a powerful expert have been sealed by only 3 sovereigns? One would think that an entity strong enough to exterminate everything in the starry sky, including all of the other sovereigns and their people, wouldn't be so weak as to be sealed by 3 sovereigns. At the moment, there was no way to answer such questions. After looking out at the void for a long time, he went back to working on the formula for 28 colored flame. All the while, the weight of that desolate void seemed to weigh down on him. Perhaps the battle with the old ghost woman had ended with her paper body being destroyed. Whatever the reason, she never came after them again, leading Bai Xiaochun to breathe a sigh of relief. A 60-year cycle passed. During that time, he would occasionally go back to the eternal immortal domains to spend time with Dabao, Xiaoxiao, Song Junwan, and Zhou Zimo. He also helped the 9 Serenities King and Spirit Advent King, as well as the eastern and northern demigods, to reach the celestial realm. Now the Arch-Emperor dynasty had 8 celestials, making them even more powerful within the eternal immortal domains. Although they didn't control the largest territory in terms of the immortal domains, they were powerful enough that their dynasty truly formed a tripartite balance of power. The only downside was that, with the exception of Gongsun Wanner, they were all in the early celestial realm. If they could get someone into the late celestial realm, then in terms of celestials, they would be the most powerful of the three nations. Bai Xiaochun had long since allowed the treasured fan to follow its own course. During the 60-year cycle which had passed, he saw one set of ruins after another and never-ending rubble. There was no other life in this void, making him feel like a time traveler witnessing the aftermath of a cataclysmic destruction. Slowly but surely, he gained a better understanding of the worlds that had populated the starry sky of the past. Bai Xiaoqi also provided details in response to the questions Bai Xiaochun asked. In addition to that, Bai Xiaochun finally conjured a 28-colored flame. His cultivation base was now at the peak of the great circle of the celestial realm, meaning that he was now extremely close to becoming an Archean. It was both a tiny gap and also a massive one. Unless he got the right opportunity and good fortune, he would not be able to bridge it. Even still, his battle prowess was even higher than before, and he had better control over his treasured fan. He could now summon 2 Archean slaves, both of whom could remain outside of the fan for 2 incense sticks worth of time. His Archean luminescence had also improved. He now had more than 50 shots, making it possible for him to defeat Archeans in battle without himself actually being one. Of course, Bai Xiaochun was not simply happy with how things were. Unless he was an Archean, he couldn't resurrect his subordinates if they died, which meant that his celestials were like trees with nothing to sink their roots into. If a storm came along, they could be wiped out overnight. Archean battle prowess was the backbone of an imperial dynasty, and the divine ability of resurrection was the only way to keep it alive long-term. Unfortunately, no matter what he tried, he couldn't come up with any way to bridge that final gap. Furthermore, multicolored flame had a lot to do with his cultivation base. By now, he realized that it was only with an Archean realm cultivation base that he could finish the formula for 29-colored flame. Eventually, he gave up all his tests and plans and settled his heart. Emptying himself out, he looked at the void, until one day, his eyes widened, and he rose to his feet. Bai Xiaoqi appeared next to him, and when he looked out, he murmured, "We meet again. This is the 9th time I've seen them." Far off in the void were countless glittering lights, which were countless crystalline lamps, eternally illuminating the coffins upon which they rested. There seemed to be too many coffins to count, perhaps millions. As they drifted through the void, they almost looked like rain. As the treasured fan slowed to a halt, Bai Xiaochun stood at its edge, looking out at the majestic scene. As the countless coffins passed by, he could see that inside them were the preserved corpses of both men and women. Unfortunately, they had existed for so long that many of them had begun to rot away, and seemed to be on the verge of disappearing altogether. It was a burial rain that continued for a long time. When the last coffin passed by, Bai Xiaochun stood there quietly, aware that this was one of the many peoples that had been involved in the massacres in the starry sky of the past. Before death, they had left this rain of coffins as their memorial within the void. In his years of travels collecting souls, Bai Xiaochun had come to a much better understanding of the void around him. And yet, despite all the ruins he had seen, nothing left him as shaken as watching millions of coffins floating by in front of him. Eventually, he turned his back on the void and sat down thoughtfully. As of this point, he was absolutely convinced that this void was a place of death, with the only life existing in the eternal immortal domains. The only things left are the souls and spirit automatons like Xiaoqi. Sighing, he looked over at Bai Xiaoqi and suddenly felt profoundly sorry for him. His own mood had sunk over the past few years, a period of time that was nothing compared to the immense span of time that the spirit automaton had floated alone through the void. It was no wonder that his attitude had been so bad when they first met. Time continued to pass in silence. Year after year, one set of ruins after another. One day, the fan suddenly began to slow down. It wasn't the work of Bai Xiaochun, nor Bai Xiaoqi. Apparently, the fan was about to reach its final destination. Off to the side, Bai Xiaoqi was panting, and his eyes flickered strangely, as though he was familiar with the location they were approaching, but at the same time, unfamiliar. The region up above was filled with so many ruins that its overall size surpassed anything Bai Xiaochun had seen so far during his travels. In fact, it was impossible to see where these ruins ended. There were destroyed buildings, crushed boulders, and innumerable destroyed magical items. Occasionally, it was even possible to see plants that were so dried and withered that they would collapse into dust if they were touched. There were also slight fluctuations in the area that instantly caused Bai Xiaochun's aura to retract slightly, and his eyes to shine. Immortal energy, he murmured, rising slowly to his feet. As soon as he sensed that energy, and looked out to determine which path the fan was following, a monumental possibility occurred to him. I bet that this place is the immortal world mentioned by the sovereign owner of the fan. In the past, it was the most flourishing location in the starry sky, and home to the most advanced civilization. It was also where this fan was created. He looked over at Bai Xiaochi and could see that strange look in his eye, as if he recognized this place, but at the same time, found it unfamiliar. That only seemed to bolster his speculation. And as he examined his surroundings more closely, he came to be convinced that he was looking at a shattered continent. From the endless dust-covered ruins, it was possible to guess how spectacular the immortal world of the past had been. Soon, an image appeared in Bai Xiaochun's mind, of a landmass that surpassed the eternal immortal domains in size by nearly 100 times. In the area surrounding that enormous landmass were hundreds of thousands of spherical objects. Although it was impossible for Bai Xiaochun to determine what those objects were, the evidence of their existence was clear, based on the wreckage that remained. Home, Bai Xiaochi murmured. Shaken, Bai Xiaochun looked around at the ruins as they slowly drifted through them. Although the fan had clearly slowed down, it was still moving as quickly as a celestial. Even moving at that speed, years passed without any end in sight. During that time, Bai Xiaochun studied the ruins around him, passing hundreds of locations that pulsed with fluctuations that caused even him to shiver with fear. Even looking closely at such locations didn't provide any further information about them. However, considering Bai Xiaochun's progress with the essence of time, he was able to determine that they were the auras of powerful experts who had died countless years in the past. At the very least, such auras were at the level of an Archean. From these ruins, Bai Xiaochun began to gain an understanding of what the immortal world of yesteryear had been like. The sheer glory and power of this place defied imagination. It was impossible to even imagine what level of power, what catastrophe, could bring an end to the majestic immortal world. The continent shattered, Bai Xiaochun murmured. The hundreds of thousands of spheroids were crushed. All of the Archeans were exterminated, and the immortal imperatrix died a bitter death. All the immortal imperator could do was create this fan and send it away, along with a clone projection. He died here. Months passed. Eventually, when the fan reached a certain area, it decelerated rapidly. When that happened, Bai Xiaochun looked around at the ruins, and realized that he felt something tugging at him, some huge object. And that object was none other than the destination of the treasured fan. Or perhaps, that enormous object had summoned the fan to it. It was what appeared to be a shockingly enormous pale white spheroid, fully 30,000 meters tall. Bai Xiaochun gasped. As for Bai Xiaochi, as soon as he saw the object, his lips quivered as though he wished to speak, and yet no words came out. However, his eyes radiated what could only be intense pain. Soon, Bai Xiaochun had an idea of what was happening. The fan began to slowly orbit the object, and as it reached the other side, Bai Xiaochun's mind began to spin. Off to the side, Bai Xiaochi let loose a weeping cry. "My lord, immortal imperator," Bai Xiaochun blurted. This was no random sphere, it was a gigantic head. As its facial features became visible, Bai Xiaochun realized that they perfectly matched those of the projection of the immortal imperator that he had met in the 100th level of the treasured fan. Crusted blood oozed out of his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. His eyes were still open, even in death, and even after all of the countless tens of thousands of years which had passed since then, it was still possible to see the immense defiance within them. Just by looking into those eyes, Bai Xiaochun could almost hear a roar of rage that shook him down to his soul. Although he had previously speculated that the treasured fan had been summoned by the very sovereign who had created it, when the moment arrived that his theory was proved correct, he simply couldn't remain calm. In fact, the grief and rage contained within the head influenced the area around it, causing everything to distort from the pressure. If it weren't for Bai Xiaochun's particularly powerful fleshly body, and the fact that he was on the fan itself, he wouldn't have been able to even get close. Even with all that protection, he still felt out of sorts, and had trouble breathing. After a bit of time passed, and he acclimated a bit, he clasped hands and bowed deeply to the immortal imperator. After expressing his thanks to the immortal imperator for creating the treasured fan, he rose from his bow and looked at the head. He murmured. Sending some divine sense out, he attempted to make contact with the head, and although it was difficult, with help from the fan, he succeeded. In that instant, he trembled, and his deoseed began to tremble as if with desperate anticipation. Shaken, Bai Xiaochun realized that there was power lurking within the sovereign's head. It was a strange power, neither immortal energy nor cultivation-based power. It actually reminded him of when he had become a celestial, and the Eternal Mother had whispered into his ear. "It's Qi Flow," Bai Xiaoqi whispered. "I know why the fan came here. It wasn't summoned by my master, but rather, from what exists inside my master's head. It's the Qi Flow of the immortal world. Bai Xiaochun, you are my lord's successor, and thus you qualify to absorb the last bit of Qi Flow from the immortal world. If you do, then breaking into the Archean realm should be as easy as turning over your hand." Bai Xiaochun looked at the sovereign's head, and as Bai Xiaoqi's voice rang in his ears, he realized that just as the spirit automaton had said, that strange power was indeed the last bit of Qi Flow from the immortal world. That Qi Flow had pulled the fan to it, which made sense considering that the Qi Flow had created the fan in this very location. As for his own Daoseed, it thirsted for that power for the same reason Bai Xiaoqi had mentioned. If he could absorb the last of the immortal world's Qi Flow, then he could easily break through into the Archean realm. This was an opportunity that any celestial would go crazy over, good fortune that was rarely encountered. Other than the eternal immortal domains, there were no other worlds in this void who had managed to preserve some of their Qi Flow through the catastrophe. Any other person besides Bai Xiaochun would have had to expend great effort to think of a way to extract that Qi Flow and absorb it. After all, it would require the approval of the Qi Flow itself. But Bai Xiaochun didn't need to worry about that. After becoming the owner of the fan, he had gained the approval of the sovereign's clone projection. In essence, he had already sown karma with the immortal world. Although it seemed like a tenuous connection, it was enough to acquire the approval of the Qi Flow. But now, he faced one main challenge: how to actually extract the Qi Flow. After a bit of analysis, his anticipation was building, and his eyes shone brightly. After all, he had been stuck in the great circle of the celestial realm for quite a while now, unable to break through. Therefore, this opportunity, this good fortune, was enough to cause his heart to swell with fervor. But as usual, he didn't act rashly. He first analyzed his surroundings, circling the area on the fan for a while, and even sending his Archean slaves out to explore a bit. Only after that did he emerge from the fan and approach the sovereign's head. As he neared, the pressure mounted, but soon enough, he was only 30 meters away from it. At this distance, it wasn't even possible to see the top of the gigantic head. All he could see was grayish skin, with wrinkles as wide as his arm was long. Enduring the uncomfortable pressure, and under the anxious gaze of Bai Xiaoqi, he performed an incantation gesture with his right hand and then pushed out toward the sovereign's head, unleashing the power of his cultivation base in an attempt to extract the Qi Flow. Unfortunately, no amount of cultivation-based power provoked any reaction from the Qi Flow. It was almost as if it didn't even know Bai Xiaochun existed. He tried various divine abilities and magical techniques. He tried biting his tongue and using his own blood. But the Qi Flow didn't react in the least. Bai Xiaochun was really starting to get nervous. After hesitating for a moment, he took another step forward, using gravitational extermination in an attempt to nullify the pressure weighing down from the sovereign's head, and even unleashing some of the aura of his undying sovereign's fist. He also transmitted a message to Bai Xiaoqi asking for help, who then used the power of the fan to strengthen him. And thus, he continued forward step by step. From the 30-meter mark, he reached 24 meters, then 15 meters, then 9 meters. Eventually, he was only one pace away, close enough to reach out and touch the head. By that point, he was trembling, and his face was magenta from the effort. Reaching out, he placed his hand onto the skin that was the surface of the sovereign's head. In that instant, his head began to spin, and he was overwhelmed with what felt like a mountain crushing down on him. If he had acquired the Qi Flow at the price of being crushed a bit, he could have accepted it. But even after touching the head, there was no reaction from the Qi Flow. Coughing up a mouthful of blood, he staggered backward until he was back on the fan. Gasping for breath, he looked over at the sovereign's head, completely flummoxed by the situation with the Qi Flow. How do I extract it? He thought. Off to the side, Bai Xiaoqi looked equally stunned and confused, and had no advice to give. Half a month passed, during which time Bai Xiaochun tried everything he could think of. Each time, he met with failure, coughed up blood, and waited to recover before trying again. Eventually, he was beginning to lose hope. Sitting there on the fan, he stared at the sovereign's head, considering if it might be possible to drag it into the face of the fan. It did not seem possible to extract the Qi Flow through ordinary means. As far as destroying the head, not only was he unable, even if he had been, he wouldn't stoop to that level. He had a bottom line in life, and repaying kindness with enmity was not something he would do. After all, in some ways, the immortal imperator was his master. And Bai Xiaochun would obviously not tolerate such profane behavior. Bai Xiaochun sat there with a frown on his face for 5 days, thinking. Eventually, his brow furrowed even more deeply as a new idea occurred to him. There seem to be 2 possibilities as to why I can't extract the chi flow. Either my methods are wrong, or I don't qualify. If I qualified, then I should be able to just beckon to the chi flow, and have it fly out to me. Therefore, I really only have one choice. I need to trick the chi flow into thinking that I'm the immortal imperator. His eyes began to shine brightly at the audacity of the idea. However, the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it seemed like a definite possibility. To trick the chi flow, I could use my Sutra of Future Paramita to connect the immortal imperator's fate to my own. If that's not enough, I could use my Sutra of Former Reincarnation to try to gain access to some of the sovereign's memories, whatever is left in his head. If I can understand his life by experiencing his memories, then I will be him, and he will be me. After pondering the situation a bit more, he blurred into motion, heading directly toward the sovereign's head, specifically, the forehead. As he got close, he reached out and touched the skin. Next, he performed an incantation gesture with his left hand, unleashing his Sutra of Future Paramita. Red strands swirled out into his left hand, transforming into a crimson paramita lily. The instant the flower entered the sovereign's head, Bai Xiaochun's mind rumbled, and something profoundly ancient filled him. At the same time, a trembling scream erupted from his mouth. My head, my head. After connecting his fate to the sovereign's, it suddenly felt like his own head had been chopped off. The pain and the sensation of death were overwhelmingly realistic. Thankfully, he had been prepared for something like this, and managed to hold on to consciousness. Then, to his excitement, the scrap of chi flow began to stir and move in his direction. Although it didn't come all the way, it covered nearly half the distance. Immediately, he brightened up. So, it's working. Well, now I need to see if I can fuse with his memories. His left hand blurred again as he unleashed the Sutra of Former Reincarnation. The instant he touched the sovereign's forehead, a tremor passed through him, and his eyes went blank. Suddenly, he didn't seem like himself, as though his soul were leaving his body, and entering a world filled with mists. This world was so huge that Bai Xiaochun began to turn completely blank, forgetting time, forgetting everything around him. Eventually, he felt someone pushing and prodding him. Wake up, little Chen. Bai Xiaochun felt like he was being prodded awake from a deep sleep. He opened his eyes, and it was as if his soul had lost access to all of his previous memories. He had no idea who he was, and only knew that he felt very cold. White, fluffy snowflakes fell from above, completely obscuring the sky, and also covering the ground, making even the distant mountains a pale white color. Bai Xiaochun found himself in a forest of withered trees. In fact, the trees were covered with so much snow that many of their branches had already snapped. The scattered branches that remained intact seemed like spots of black within the wider world of whiteness. Do not fall asleep, little Chen, someone said. Stay awake. Bai Xiaochun felt like he had been dreaming, except he couldn't remember what the dream had been about. Now that he was awake, everything was all a blur. All he knew was that it was cold, so cold that he felt like he might freeze. Perhaps the cold had sealed his memories. But then, he felt himself being prodded a few times, and a face appeared in front of him, white with frost. It was a youngster, about 13 or 14 years old. He was gaunt, and apparently injured, as his clothing was torn and stained with blood. He looked very weak, but there was something about his eyes that was completely unforgettable. They shimmered like stars, but at the same time, contained a ruthlessness that belied his young age. And yet, when he gazed at Bai Xiaochun, that ruthlessness vanished, to be replaced with warmth and love. Brother, Bai Xiaochun murmured, his lips quivering. Yes, his memories were telling him that this was indeed his older brother, a blood brother with whom he shared both father and mother. Even saying that one word, brother, caused a wave of exhaustion to pass through him. He almost wasn't sure he could deal with the biting wind, a wild wind that filled him with bleakness and desolation. It was obviously the dead of winter, what with the falling snowflakes. However, as he looked up into the sky, he realized that there were also bugs flying high up in the sky, pale white locusts. Apparently, their presence within the snowstorm was what had led to the famine which gripped the lands. There were other people in the area, refugees who huddled against the wind, their gaunt frames and listless expressions making it difficult to tell if they were even alive. They all feared the cold, and yet, no one seemed willing to start a fire. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't dare. When Bai Xiaochun looked at the locusts in the snowstorm, he could instantly tell that they were unique in more than one way. Not only could they survive in this icy cold, but it was also obvious that fire would attract their attention. And in the dead of winter, when food was scarce, they would eat anything they could find. The weight of all of these thoughts seemed to weaken him, to the point where he could barely lift his hand. However, he somehow managed to do that, and when he did, he saw the hand of a 7 or 8-year-old. His hand dropped back down, and he struggled to keep his eyes open. The young man who had spoken moments ago seemed relieved to see Bai Xiaochun awake. However, he could also see how weak he was, and how he was having trouble keeping his eyes open. He prodded him anxiously a few more times, clearly grieving at the fact that his younger brother was having trouble hanging on to life. The problem was hunger. Only if he could find food to eat would his brother have the strength to keep on living. Hang in there a bit longer, little Chen. I'll get some food for you. Just wait, I'll be back right away. Determination flashed in the youngster's eyes, and as he turned away from his younger brother, the ruthlessness returned to his face. Looking like a lone wolf, he stalked off into the forest. He was clearly in a weak state, but apparently, Bai Xiaochun's moment of crisis had unlocked shocking toughness within him. Ignoring his injuries and his weakness, he vanished into the trees. Brother, Bai Xiaochun murmured, although his voice was too quiet for anyone to hear. He knew that his big brother was going to get food for him, and vaguely remembered that it was only after the white locusts had arrived that the famine started, and disease spread. Everyone back home in their village had either starved to death or died of disease, including their parents. Bai Xiaochun knew that the only reason he was alive was his brother's strength. After he had fallen sick, his brother had cared for him and even carried him on his back during their journey. When the adults had begun to fight amongst each other for food, his brother had developed a ruthlessness that even they feared. His brother gave him most of the food. Even when his brother's stomach growled with hunger, he pretended to be full, and would say, "I'm your big brother, aren't I? Here, eat." Thus, Bai Xiaochun remained alive. He remembered that his name was Zhou Chen, and his older brother was Zhou Fan. And he was also sure that, without the dead weight that was himself, his ruthless brother would definitely have had it much better off in this chaotic world. 1. Unfortunately, despite how his brother had cared for him, his sickness had weakened him to the point where he couldn't hang on for much longer. Without me, my brother would have a much better life, he thought. Eventually, he closed his eyes and let the snowflakes begin to cover him up, the flame of his life force beginning to flicker out. However, even as that was about to happen, a powerful force pushed the snow away, scattering even the white locusts in the area. At the same time, an old man descended from above, clad in a Taoist robe, an unsightly expression on his face. As soon as the refugees in the area saw the old man, they kowtowed, trembling. They opened their mouths as if to beg for his help, but even as they did, locusts began to crawl out from inside them. None of them had the power to even scream as they simply waited to die. The old man looked at all of the refugees who had already been infected by the parasitic locusts, and a gleam of pity appeared in his eyes. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could do about the situation. Waving his hands, he put the tortured refugees out of their misery. Clearly in a horrific mood, the old man turned to leave, which was when he noticed Bai Xiaochun. He muttered, stopping in place and looking more closely. A moment later, his eyes lit up with disbelief. A Dao body? Walking over to Bai Xiaochun, he waved his hand, causing a warmth to enter him that stabilized the flickering flame of his life force. As he looked closer at Bai Xiaochun, his eyes began to shine even more brightly. Throwing his head back, he laughed heartily before picking the unconscious Bai Xiaochun up and flying up into the air with him. After enough time passed for an incense stick to burn, the emaciated Zhou Fan staggered back. Snow was piled up on his shoulders and head, and each step he took left drops of blood on the snow. He had a few new wounds on his face, and he was bleeding from his abdomen. He was in very bad shape, and yet, his eyes flickered with excitement. Tucked into the fold of his garment was a steamed bun, soaked with blood, that he had risked his life to rob from someone else. Little Chen, I found some food for. Before he could finish speaking, his face fell as he noticed all the corpses in the area. Looking around anxiously, he rushed over to where he had left Bai Xiaochun, only to find no one there. That, and the sight of all of locusts devouring the nearby corpses, made his heart seize. Little Chen, he wailed. Little Chen, he had lost his only relative. He had lost everything. Trembling, he continued to search in vain. In the end, he dropped down onto the very spot where his brother had been lying, holding the blood-soaked bun, and began to weep. Little Chen. In his despair, he didn't notice that the scent of the blood had attracted a horde of white locusts, who descended from the sky and swarmed over him. Somewhere in the void, in the ruins of the immortal world, next to the sovereign's head, Bai Xiaochi was paying close attention to everything. He saw Bai Xiaochun shiver and then weaken in unprecedented fashion. He seemed to be instantly drained of energy, and blood began to ooze out of the corners of his mouth as he toppled down and away from the statue. However, at the same time, the chi flow, which had remained unmoving this entire time, stirred, and 30% of it shot toward Bai Xiaochun. That portion of the chi flow entered Bai Xiaochun, causing him to shiver. Soon, he was back on the treasured fan, looking exhausted but excited. As the 30% of the chi flow entered him, his cultivation base power suddenly formed a resonance with the ruins of the immortal world. It caused his mind to reel as shocking transformations occurred to his cultivation base. As of this moment, Bai Xiaochun was sure that if he could absorb the rest of that chi flow, and formed a complete resonance with the ruins of the immortal world, then his cultivation base would definitely break through to the next level. What did you see? Bai Xiaochi asked anxiously. I saw. Strange light flickered in his eyes as he recalled what he had just experienced. He remembered being Zhou Chen, and how he had forgotten that he was Bai Xiaochun. It was as if he had actually become Zhou Chen. More precisely, everything he had said, and even his thoughts, were all memories, recollections of things that had occurred in the past. Bai Xiaochun looked over at Bai Xiaochi. The immortal imperator's name was Zhou Chen? Bai Xiaochi shivered. Looking back in shock at Bai Xiaochun, he quietly said, so you really did succeed. Although everything he had said before was true, and he really did hope that Bai Xiaochun would be able to get that chi flow, he had believed it to be too hard. And when Bai Xiaochun had fallen moments ago, his hesitation had grown. But now, he found out that Bai Xiaochun had actually succeeded. I saw the immortal imperator as a youth. Bai Xiaochun closed his eyes and thought back to everything he had seen. Frowning, he realized that he was still somewhat under the effects of what had just happened. As soon as he thought back to the sovereign's brother, a swell of fondness rose up in his heart. If I continue with this, the emotional effects will probably get more serious. But I have to do it. I need this chi flow to achieve my cultivation base breakthrough. After considering matters for a bit, he decided that although there were some risks, he could accept that. Eyes flashing with determination, he once again flew up toward the sovereign's head. Having been through the process once before, and having already acquired 30% of the chi flow, he quickly unleashed his Sutra of the Future and Sutra of the Former. His mind began to reel, and he felt the same thing as last time. His mind went blank. Time passed, and then he opened his eyes. Blinding sunlight stabbed into his eyes, but he didn't close them. He stood outside a valley of black clouds, tall, handsome, and the very picture of righteousness and vitality. However, there was something that pained him in his heart, a feeling that he couldn't dispel. The last time he had entered the sovereign's memories, he had been young, but now, Zhou Chen was middle-aged. Many things had happened since his youth, and he had accomplished much. He wasn't alone outside of the valley of black clouds. A few hundred people were at his side, all of them cultivators, and they were flanked by thousands more cultivators. Clearly, they had this area locked down tight. Even further back were tens of thousands of cultivators, gathered in ranks, causing immense pressure to weigh down on the area. All gazes in the area were fixed on one thing. Standing in front of Zhou Chen, with his back to the valley of black clouds, was a middle-aged cultivator in a black robe, with long black hair and blood smeared all over his face. He was also handsome, but in a vicious, evil way. His eyes were violet, and his expression was ice-cold. The murderous aura he radiated could shake heaven and earth, and could not even be suppressed by the tens of thousands of cultivators in the area. Unfortunately, he was injured, with his chest caved in, and his right leg broken. The pain involved must have been intense, but he simply stood there looking out, not at the tens of thousands of cultivators but at one person. That person was Bai Xiaochun, or rather, Zhou Chen. Brother, Bai Xiaochun said, his voice filled with pain. He almost seemed to be pleading, although he didn't realize it. Come back with me. I can be your guarantor. It's not your fault you did all those things. His pain and guilt stemmed from how, years ago, he had pled with his master to go search for his brother, Zhou Fan. Unfortunately, they hadn't been able to find him. At that point, he had sworn to avenge his death, and had gone crazy practicing cultivation. Later on, he had exterminated the entire White Locust dynasty, which at that time had come to dominate all of the immortal world's lower three heavens. Eventually, the world returned to normal, and Zhou Chen felt that he could breathe a sigh of relief. However, he was never able to forget about that older brother of his. Years later, he came to find that the immortal world had 9 heavens, and that he lived in the lower 3 heavens. Eventually, he became one of the most well-known figures there, the subject of much adoration. That was when Zhou Fan reappeared. He led the forces of the Black Locust dynasty, which were far more terrifying than the White Locust dynasty. As they spread through the lower three heavens, consuming everything in their path, they added the power of their victims to Zhou Fan's cultivation base. It was a vile, terrifying technique that caused widespread alarm among the cultivators of the lower three heavens. A bitter war was fought for many years. It was a difficult, deadly era that culminated in this event. I'll even give up my shot at reaching the middle three heavens if it will keep you safe. Bai Xiaochun continued. Brother, please, come with me. Mixed emotions could be seen in the eyes of the black-robed Zhou Fan. However, he shook his head, and his eyes turned as cold as ice. From now on, little Chen, you and I are not family. Looking around at the surrounding cultivators, he smiled mockingly, then turned and walked into the valley of black clouds. No one attempted to stop him. As far as they were concerned, stepping into that valley meant that he was already dead, exterminated. In apparent confirmation of their assumption, as Zhou Fan walked into the clouds, they began to eat away at his body. He trembled as he walked forward, his flesh rotting off, bones becoming visible. As he corroded, waves of black locusts erupted from inside of him, shrieking in pain as they tried to escape. Before they could, they were obliterated by the clouds. Everyone else sighed in relief. But not Bai Xiaochun. Pain gripped his heart as he watched his brother being eaten away by the clouds. Finally, he stepped forward and called out in a loud voice, Brother, why are you doing this? Tell me, why? Zhou Fan was clearly having a hard time struggling forward. When he heard his brother's voice, he stopped for a moment, then opened his mouth as if to speak. However, he said nothing. Bowing his head, he continued onward, rotting away. By now, he was little more than bones, making a completely fearsome sight. Only his eyes continued to burn with obsession and focus as he strode deeper into the valley of clouds. Already, it was possible for him to see something at the end of the valley, in the depths of the black clouds, something enormous. It was a battleship. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.